The streets of Fayetteville, West Virginia, hold the secret of a true Christmas horror. As the night before Christmas draws near, the town is unnervingly quiet, broken only by faint music drifting from a loudspeaker at a storefront downtown. Inside the small homes, families gather, exchanging stories about gifts, parties, and, inevitably, the haunting mystery of what truly happened to the Sodder family on that fateful Christmas morning 80 years ago. The tragedy of the Sodder family is something everyone knows, yet no one can agree on. But here are the undeniable facts. On Christmas Eve, 1945, George and Jenny Sodder went to bed with 9 of their 10 children asleep under their roof. But they would awaken to a nightmare that would forever change their lives in the most tragic way imaginable. It was Christmas Eve, 1945. The Appalachian town of Fayetteville, West Virginia, lay quiet under a cold winter sky. Among the modest homes dotting the landscape, one stood out for its warmth and festivity that night, the house of the Sodder family. George and Jenny Sodder, Italian immigrants who had built a life for themselves in America, were celebrating the holiday with their 10 children. The Sodders were well respected in the community, known for their hard work and resilience. But by dawn, the laughter and joy that had filled their home would be replaced by despair, and the Sodder story would become a chilling mystery that has remained unsolved for nearly 8 decades. The evening began like any other Christmas Eve. Marion, the eldest daughter, had brought home gifts for her younger siblings from her job at a local dime store. The children were ecstatic, their excitement filling the house as they played with their new toys. George and Jenny, weary from the day's preparations, retired early with their youngest daughter, Sylvia, while the older children stayed up to keep the celebration alive. Around midnight, the stillness of the night was broken by the shrill ring of the telephone. Jenny, always the vigilant mother, rose from bed to answer it. On the other end was a woman's voice, unfamiliar and unsettling. The caller asked for someone Jenny didn't recognize. In the background, Jenny could hear faint laughter and the clinking of glasses, as if the woman were at a party. When Jenny explained she must have the wrong number, the caller laughed, a strange, unnerving sound that sent a chill down Jenny's spine, and hung up abruptly. Feeling unsettled, Jenny checked on the house. The lights were still on, the curtains wide open, and the front door unlocked. Odd, considering the family's usual routines. She turned off the lights, closed the curtains, and locked the door before heading back to bed. But sleep wouldn't come easily. Moments later, she was startled by a loud thud on the roof, followed by the sound of something rolling. Jenny froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She waited, listening for any further noises, but the house remained silent. Deciding it was nothing to worry about, she eventually drifted back to sleep. Yet, unknown to Jenny, the night's strange occurrences were far from over. Jenny awoke again around 1:30, this time to the smell of smoke. As the panic surged through her, she bolted out of bed and rushed to wake George. They froze in horror as they realized the house was on fire. Flames roared up the staircase, cutting off the attic where their children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, age 5 through 14, were trapped. Frantic, George and Jenny screamed for their children, their voices hoarse with desperation. Marion, Sylvia, and 2 of the older boys, John and George Jr., managed to escape the inferno, but the 5 youngest did not respond. Jenny's screams echoed through the house as George raced outside, determined to rescue his children. The ladder he always kept propped against the house was gone, vanished, as if it had never been there. George then tried driving one of his coal trucks up to the house, thinking he could scale it and stand on the top to reach the second floor. But neither of the engines would turn over in the frigid air, despite working perfectly fine the day before. Meanwhile, Marion ran to a neighbor's house to call the fire department, only to discover that their phone line wasn't working. Another local, who happened to see the blaze, drove into town and initiated the local fire alarm system, a phone tree system where volunteers were individually called up to respond to the fire. By the time firefighters reached the scene, the Sodders' home had been reduced to smoldering ash. Steve Cruikshank, a firefighter in Fayetteville since 1967, later explained the cause of the delay was due to a lack of resources, with many of the town's young men losing their lives in the war. George and Jenny could only stand helpless, their screams swallowed by the roar of the flames and the crackling of the inferno. All that remained of the Sodder house was a basement full of ashes. But as the ashes cooled, the true horror began to unfold. As the sun rose, police along with George and Jenny searched the remains of the home, desperate for any sign of their missing children. They expected to find something, bones, teeth, anything, but the ashes yielded no trace of their 5 youngest. The fire chief, F.J. Morris, suggested that the blaze had burned so intensely that it had completely incinerated their bodies. George and Jenny were in a state of disbelief, but initially took the officials at their word that the 5 children had likely perished in the fire. On December 30th, 1945, the family was issued 5 death certificates for each of their children, which listed their cause of death as fire or suffocation. George and Jenny were advised to steer clear of the scene while another search was held, but less than a week later, a bulldozer cleared the rubble and buried what was left of the house in 5 feet of dirt. The site would become a memorial to the children, and the rest of the Sodders would live in a house on the other side of the pine tree that overlooked their old home. As they attempted to move on with their lives, the mystery of what happened that tragic Christmas day deepened in the days, weeks, and months after the fire took place. An investigation ruled faulty wiring in George's study was the cause of the blaze, but George began to have doubts about that conclusion, remembering a local power company had recently inspected the wiring. There was also the strange disappearance of the ladder, which was usually propped against the Sodders' house, but couldn't be located on the night of the fire. It was later found discarded down an embankment 70 feet from the property fence. As a part of their investigation, authorities also discovered the telephone line to the house had been cut on the night of the blaze. Neighbors told police they had seen a shadowy man near the Sodder house on Christmas Eve stealing a block and chain from George's garage. The man was later tracked down and identified as local, Lonnie Johnson. He pleaded guilty to theft and cutting the phone line, but denied any involvement with the fire. With so many odd occurrences surrounding the Christmas Eve tragedy, the Sodders started to wonder if the blaze had been deliberately lit. They also began to suspect their 5 children did not perish on Christmas Day, but may have been kidnapped and the fire used to cover it up. Jenny, being the skeptical and protective mother, refused to believe the authorities' explanation. Determined to understand the fire's destructive power, she conducted her own experiments. She burned animal bones in her kitchen stove, observing that no matter how long or how hot the fire burned, the bones would not disintegrate entirely. A local crematorium later confirmed her findings, explaining that even at temperatures of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, bones would not be entirely destroyed. The Sodder fire had burned for only 45 minutes, far too short a time to leave no trace of the children. Adding to the mystery, several small objects were found in the rubble, including several shards of vertebrae, but a pathologist's report conducted by the Smithsonian later concluded the bones were most likely from the supply of dirt George used to fill in the memorial. It is very strange that no other bones were found in the allegedly careful search of the basement of the house, a report said. But if the 5 children had survived the blaze, where were they? As George and Jenny searched for answers, more peculiar details emerged. A bus driver passing through Fayetteville on the night of the fire reported seeing fireballs being thrown at the house. Months later, Sylvia found a small, hard object in the rubble. George took it to a military expert who identified it as an incendiary device, a potential explanation for the thud Jenny had heard on the roof. Other witnesses also came forward with reports of sightings. A woman claimed to have seen the missing children in a car as the fire raged. Another woman working at a hotel in Charleston, just a town over from Fayetteville, was reading a newspaper report about the Sodder fire one day when a photo of the children caught her attention. The black and white image, showing the 5 children's solemn faces, bore a striking resemblance to 4 children she had seen at her workplace on Christmas Day. The children were accompanied by 2 women and 2 men, all of Italian descent. The woman recalled that the group registered at the hotel around midnight and stayed in a large room with several beds. Though she attempted to speak with the children, the men became hostile and refused to allow her to talk to them. One of the men glared at her and quickly spoke to the others in Italian. Immediately, the entire group stopped engaging with her, and she felt a cold distance between them. Realizing she was being shut out, she said nothing more. The group left early the next morning. Later, a worker at a tourist stop 50 miles away reported serving breakfast to a group of children who were with 2 men and 2 women of Italian descent. The worker stated that the children seemed frightened and refused to speak. Rumors swirled in Fayetteville, casting suspicion on everyone and everything. Months before the fire, a local salesman had threatened George after he refused to buy life insurance. "Your house will go up in smoke," the man had warned, "and your children will be destroyed." Strangely, the same insurance salesman who had made the threat also served on the coroner's jury on December 26th, which determined the fire was caused by faulty wiring. He was never investigated. There were speculations of foul play due to George's strong opinions about the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, who had been executed months before the fire. George's outspoken criticism had earned him enemies within the local Italian community. However, the authorities never pursued that lead either. The mystery deepened in 1968 when Jenny received an envelope containing a photograph of a young man. On the back was a cryptic note, "L.S. Love Brother Frankie, 35. The man in the photo bore a striking resemblance to Louis, who had been 9 years old at the time of the fire. The Sodders hired a private investigator to follow up, but he vanished without a trace. The origins of the photograph remain unknown, leaving another haunting question in a case full of them. The family was also convinced that their daughter, Betty, was one of the school children photographed in a magazine they were reading. George traveled all the way to her school in Manhattan in hopes of speaking to her parents, but they refused to see him. Other potential leads took them all over the country, from Mexico to Florida, Tennessee to New York. For decades, the Sodders searched for answers, and they even erected a billboard along Route 16, displaying photographs of their children and offering a reward for information. The billboard became a local landmark and a heartbreaking reminder of a family's unyielding hope. Despite their relentless efforts, the fate of the Sodder children remains unknown. Each clue seems to lead to more questions, leaving the case unresolved and unsettling. So every Christmas, the people of Fayetteville go over what happened that night, repeating the same reasons for believing their version of the story of the Sodder children, and the reminder of how quickly life can change and how some mysteries refuse to be laid to rest. If you've made it this far, thanks for watching. If you'd like to support the channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notifications bell. If you have a story suggestion, drop it in the comments section, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.